Okay, welcome everyone to today's event. My name is Jo. I am the Programme Manager for PG Laws, and today we're welcoming students from the PG Laws University of London programme, as well as LLM students from UCL and from Queen Mary. So welcome, whichever one you've come from today. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Professor Alexandra Xanthaki, who is our chair for today.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to be here to chair this session and to introduce you to Jane Connors, who is the United Nations Victims' Rights Advocate on Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, and her title is Assistant Secretary to the UN Secretary General. Jane Connors has served as a Director of International Advocacy for Amnesty International. So she has this background also in activism, and she also held various positions at the United Nations. And I can tell you from my own experience that she's very well regarded at the United Nations and the Office of the High Commissioner. This is where she worked as well. And before she joined the United Nations, she also held academic posts in the United Kingdom and Australia. So she has traversed through academia, activism, and advocacy, and now at the United Nations. So we're really looking forward to what she has to tell us. So please, Ms. Connors.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, if I may, and welcome to all of the students, whatever time zone you're in. Great thanks to Jo for organizing this. I'm really happy to be here. One of my academic posts was at SOAS, and I was there from 1983 to 1996, so a long time, and I miss it, I have to say. And during that time, I designed several courses for the postgraduate program of the London LLM. And one of them was the human rights of women. And that's another story. It was started being offered in 1994. I believe it's still taught, but I can tell you it was a very difficult thing to pull off because there was no belief that you would have anything to say about the human rights of women at that time. But today I'll move on and talk about what I'm doing now. I'm the first victims' rights advocate for victims of sexual exploitation and abuse by United Nations and related personnel. So there are others, other mandate holders who deal with sexual violence in conflict, children and armed conflict, violence against children, but they're outside looking. So they look at perpetrators outside of our system. I look exactly at those perpetrators who are inside our system, but I'm not so interested in them. I'm interested in the victims, and I'll talk about the role. What I'll do is I'll provide background to the role, outline what the Secretary General, his approach to prevention and response to sexual exploitation and abuse, and focus on the central element, which he calls for elevating the rights and dignity of victims. And I'll talk about some of the challenges. I'll talk a little bit about the work and some of the challenges. And I hope not to talk for very long, because much more interesting from me is to hear from you. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with some of this work, and I know you'll have critical analysis. I think we've inundated you with documents, and I won't go through those documents, but at some point you might want to have a look at them. But I'm a great believer in giving you what we have that you can look at later. Just starting first with the background. We have in the United Nations system, it's a system, it's a little bit like London University in terms of a system. We have about 35 entities or more, and that is the United Nations system. It's very, very difficult, and if you ever want to, it's not difficult, it's just amorphous, but if you ever want to get on top of it, there's a really excellent handbook that is produced every year, the New Zealand Handbook on the United Nations, which provides you with a very simple overview of the system. So I recommend it to you. Within those entities, we have about 100,000 staff members, maybe more. And they're the actual staff members. We also have non-staff personnel. We have thousands of uniformed military and police. we have contractors and partners, and most of those people perform their work with integrity and comply with UN standards. And their service brings benefits to many. They work in difficult, sometimes very dangerous situations. And in terms of peace operations, just to give you the numbers, since the first mission in 1948 to the 31st of January this year, 4,280 uniformed and civilian personnel have been killed. And that's just peace operations. So if we're looking at humanitarian development, also they are harmed. But that's the good side. Now the bad side. There are allegations, many substantiated, of sexual exploitation and abuse by our personnel. And the victims are depressingly the women, men, girls and boys we have pledged to protect and assist. And the allegations also implicate people working in charities and other organizations who develop and deliver humanitarian and development aid. And we don't deliver all of the stuff. We rely on those entities to deliver our programs on the ground. And we call them and their staff implementing partners. So if you're looking at a country like the Central African Republic, we have certain staff, but most of the programs are delivered by non-governmental organizations, either national or international. Now, of course, exploitation and abuse causes harm and suffering to victims. It can be long-lasting or life-changing, but I hate it when people say their lives are destroyed because people are extremely resilient. Many are left with children because people, they think they're in a relationship, but they're not. They have profound negative impact on communities in the short and longer term. They compound existing vulnerabilities. They normalize these misconducts and create a culture of impunity, suggesting they're permissible. And they've got a long-term intergenerational impact. One commentator suggests they create an exploitation economy, which underpins networks which facilitate sexual exploitation and abuse more broadly, such as trafficking, sex tourism. And this exploitation economy remains well after our personnel have left. They fracture trust amongst our populations, undermining our credibility, legitimacy, neutrality, and moral authority. And sometimes this frustrates the work. I mean, who is going to be keen on working, or who is going to be keen on interacting with an entity whose personnel engage in this sort of conduct? We've tried in the UN to prevent and respond to these allegations for over 20 years. They were not really, there's a long history of looking at sexual misconduct. It's only quite recently that sexual misconduct has been seen as more than a private issue, has been moved out of the private sphere into the public sphere. But so there's been more than 20 years of attempting to deal with this. And we've had successive Secretary General implementing what is described as a zero tolerance policy, which requires action on every allegation. There is just so many prevention and response measures, and they continue put in place, and they continue to be crafted and implemented. We have prohibitions, which are set out originally in 2002 in 6 core principles of what is called the Interagency Standing Committee. This is a coordination mechanism for United Nations and non-United Nations partners providing humanitarian assistance. They were adopted after the publication of a report on sexual exploitation and abuse by humanitarian workers in East Africa. So they're the first, and you can look at these, but they're reflected in what is the legislative framework. The Secretary General's Bulletin on Special Measures for Protection from Sexual Exploitation and Sexual Abuse, adopted in 2003. So our overarching framework is quite new when you think about things. And this defines what I'm going to talk about and outlines the responsibilities of staff, managers, and leaders. We sent you the bulletin, but just briefly, and have a look at it because the definitions are quite important. Sexual exploitation is any actual or attempted abuse of a position of vulnerability, differential power, or trust for sexual purposes, including but not limited to profiting monetarily, socially, or politically from the sexual exploitation of another. So it's, you're lawyers, so you will know it's complicated definitions. Sexual abuse, the actual or threatened physical intrusion of a sexual nature, whether by force or under unequal conditions. And I think it's interesting to see, even in 2003, we have this stress on differential power, unequal conditions, positions of vulnerability. This bulletin also prohibits sexual activity with children, and a child is a person for the United Nations under 18, and that's regardless of the age of majority or consent locally. We had so that we had an exception which relating to children who are married to people under the age of 18 married to UN personnel, but that has now been removed by the Secretary General. So any sexual activity with somebody under the age of 18, irrespective of whether you're married to them, is in fact prohibited. There's strong discouragement of sexual relationships between UN staff and beneficiaries of assistance. These are considered as being based on inherently unequal power dynamics, and they're seen as undermining credibility and integrity of UN work. And that's where a lot of the issues arise, because there are arguments. They'll say this is a genuine relationship, even though this is a beneficiary of assistance. I'm never convinced that there's a genuine relationship between UN staff and beneficiaries of assistance because of the inherent power imbalance. These rules, and as I say, look at them at some point in the future, you'll find them in the rules and policies of all UN system entities, and they're also in the Memorandum of Understanding that we reach with military contingents and form police units. So with the countries that contribute our blue helmets, the military and the formed police units. If you have an allegation of sexual exploitation or abuse, which is substantiated, that is classified as serious misconduct. For a civilian staff member, that results in what is described as separation, dismissal, and referral to the state of jurisdiction if the allegation might meet the definition of a crime. And we have an interesting case that was where a UN individual last year who had engaged not in sexual exploitation and abuse of a beneficiary, that of a person with whom he worked. He was in fact convicted in his state of jurisdiction, and now he's serving 15 years in prison. Credible allegations related to uniformed personnel lead to their repatriation. They are sent home. Investigations, disciplinary and accountability measures are the prerogative of the contributing state. So some of you may have seen, some of you may follow media coverage of this area of work, but often the media are confused. We have no authority in terms of investigations, disciplinary or accountability measures with regard to uniformed personnel beyond sending them home. So we cannot discipline them, we cannot investigate them, though there is a possibility that there could be joint investigations, and if the member state doesn't start investigating, some might begin by our internal investigations. But the prerogative with regard to those people you think about when you think about sexual exploitation and abuse in terms of accountability is in the hands of the member state. We have some other interesting things that have happened recently. If you have a substantiated allegation of sex, if you are a person and there's a substantiated allegation of sexual exploitation or abuse, or you left for any reason during an investigation, your name will be in a database, ClearCheck, a UN system-wide database. And the idea is to prevent people moving around the system. And 33 of our entities participate in this mechanism. There is another mechanism for civil society organizations called the Misconduct Disclosure Scheme. It's not a database. It is a more or less an enhanced referencing scheme, also to prevent rehiring of perpetrators. Of course, those outside the UN have a lot of difficulties creating databases of this because of the various privacy and confidentiality requirements, particularly of the European Union. Another, and this is very important and this is interesting, the Secretary General also has a capacity, which is devolved on him by the General Assembly, to send home, repatriate military or formed police units where there's credible evidence of widespread or systemic sexual exploitation and or abuse. And he did this in 2021 with regard to a contingent from Gabon, in the Central African Republic. So they had been involved in sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, and there were widespread, really widespread. So they were sent home. And that power is also in the Secretary General if the state doesn't investigate allegations, hold perpetrators accountable, and inform him of progress in these areas. He can do that with those people, and he's in a position to determine whether, once there's been a repatriation, whether that state should be allowed to participate in peacekeeping at all. So that's the framework they're the sort of big picture with regard to the standards, big picture with regard to what happens to you and who has the power to do what. But despite all of these policies, the sanctions, and the many, many efforts we have to engender accountability of staff, particularly leadership in prevention and response, risk assessments, management policies and tools, mandatory regular training, pre-deployment and post-deployment, allegations continue to surface. We have a website on which you see allegations reflected more or less in real time. We have an annual report, an annex to which more or less indicates what allegations occurred in the reporting year. Where, with regard to these allegations, the contributing state and the mission where the misconduct occurred are named, where we've got uniformed personnel. But these reports we have, the official reports, do not in any way, shape or form reflect reality. We have the media and academia uncovering others. And I think some of you may have seen the coverage of the Ebola response in Eastern Congo during 2018 to 2020, relating to WHO personnel. They were surfaced through the New Humanitarian. The New Humanitarian and Al Jazeera published articles quite recently on South Sudan. And indeed, on Women's Day, sadly enough, the New Humanitarian produced more coverage of the situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This journal, the New Humanitarian, follows this issue very, very closely. So if you want to have, horror stories relating to exploitation and or abuse of UN personnel, it's worthwhile having a look at what they come up with. And I was interested to see today that WHO, I believe yesterday, separated a manager It doesn't indicate that he was involved in sexual misconduct, but certainly in bullying. So, which is quite difficult because WHO has quite a complicated governance structure. So, the new approach, getting to what I do. So, the background to this was the creation of my post was the revelations of sexual exploitation and abuse by uniformed personnel, so the blue helmets, in the Central African Republic in 2014. And these allegations, there were many. The Central African Republic is a very difficult place and extremely difficult, and I think with the DRC, produces most of the allegations, many substantiated on these misconducts. So these allegations surfaced. Then there was a delayed and, I can say frankly, chaotic response by the United Nations. It failed to prioritize the interest and experience of the victims. And then an independent review was established. It released a report in 2015, which was transmitted to the General Assembly the next year in 2016. And it's a damning report, and the people who were involved in the independent review are very well respected. The report generated a lot of soul searching across our organizations, and more or less informed the incoming Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and when he took his oath of office before he started his job in January 2017, said he was going to do whatever he could to deal with this misconduct. And he launched, indeed, almost just 6 weeks after he got into post, what he described as a new approach. And that new approach has 4 elements. The first is the element that I'm supposed to lead, placing the rights and dignity of victims at the center of prevention and response. Then ending impunity, engaging all stakeholders, and reorienting our communications towards transparency and promoting the UN as a global platform to exchange good practices. I'll just talk about the central element, which is the focus on victims' rights and the complex and lasting impact of these misconducts on them, their families and communities. It's the principal element of the strategy, and it's extraordinary because it is a shift from earlier approaches. They prioritized organizational reputation and the conduct and discipline of our personnel. What do they call it? They call it the train and punish approach. So they more or less trained the people, punished them if they went wrong, and it seems peculiar that we had lost sight of who is actually at the center of the misconduct, and those at the center of the misconduct are the women, girls, men, and boys. And it's interesting because even with this shift, anytime I'm in an external meeting, people talk about the accountability of the perpetrator. So they talk about, what can you do to, deal with the reputation of the organization? What can you deal with the perpetrator? They lose sight of exactly who we should be dealing with. And my role was created to operationalize this element. I'm supposed to work across the whole of the UN system. I'm supposed to, in headquarters locations and also the field, to identify ways to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse, and if they occur, promote and protect victims' rights to report, receive support, and ensure their cases are properly managed and perpetrators held accountable. And I have focused all of my work on the victims' rights to report, receive support, and have their cases properly managed. The perpetrators, others can deal. I'm very keen on their accountability, but I think for me, accountability to the victims is the priority. So there are various forms of accountability, and my priority is to the victims. The Secretary General also asked that there be designation of senior victims' rights officers in the countries from which the greatest number of allegations had come. And they were at that time the Central African Republic and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and that remains the case. And then Haiti, where we had a lot of allegations from some years ago, and I can talk about those a bit, and South Sudan. South Sudan, I know, has many, would have allegations if people came forward. So they more or less mirror my role on the ground, and they are really the workhorse behind this, the workhorses rather, behind this policy. They remain in direct and regular contact with victims. They accompany them as they report, participate in investigations. They keep them abreast of their cases. I do a lot of work. I mean, we've only got at this point these 4 senior victims' rights officers. But because of the impact they've had, they've really had brought people forward. They've really created trust. And I am supported by the Secretary General here. I advocate for the creation of more posts of this nature, for support of the existing post holders. And if it's not possible, I ask that UN country teams and others appoint victims' rights focal points, so they could be double-hatted. So there is someone who has a role which is centered on the rights of the victims. And we've had a little bit of success. We've got at least 5 United Nations country teams which have appointed victims' rights focal points in the development context. So, and it's very important not to lose sight of the fact that although most of the coverage is of the blue helmets, the peacekeeping operations, humanitarian and development contexts also have these allegations. We began work in September 2017, so we're infants in UN terms, and we face many challenges in being integrated into existing structures. And that, I think, is because we're an uncomfortable reminder of United Nations sexual misconduct. So we are about ourselves, and it's a little bit, sort of a little bit like the allegations with regard to sexual misconduct in religious structures, in sporting structures. We are about ourselves. And what I'm doing today is I advocate with member states, United Nations partners, all sectors of civil society, the media, academia, and what I seek to do is give visibility to victims and remind everybody that we're talking about, as I say, a woman, girl, man or boy who is hurt, fearful, often excluded, subject to reprisals, intersectional discrimination and stigma. I spend a lot of time developing, creating policy and developing policies projects to support victims. I push entities, it's quite difficult, to remember that their policies and programs have to be rights-based and empowering for victims. And I underline that everybody has different needs and responses have to be tailored. You can't have a one-size-fits-all. This is not how you deal with people. I visit countries. That's a critical part of my work. I most recently visited Mali to see how the victims' rights approach is being implemented on the ground. And when I visit, I meet with victims. If they want to meet with me, I don't inflict myself on people, on their own terms, by myself, with an interpreter if necessary, to hear from them directly. And their concerns are very similar, and they're similar to the victims of most wrongs, most violations. They say there are inaccessible, unclear, or complex complaint or reporting mechanisms. Big concern, they lack protection. They are scared. They are frightened of reprisals. There's limited support for them, limited or even none in some places, medical, psychological, educational and livelihood support. Investigative procedures can be distressing because investigators are interested in the case. and the witness is the victim. So they're going to seek to get what they want out of the victim, and they can be quite difficult. And they often have repeated interviews, they often have pretty tough interviews. There's little or no support for legal or other redress, and this is particularly paternity child maintenance claims. Patchy information on the progress of their cases, including whether the abuser has been accountable in some way. They also complain that they can't get documentation or laboratory results, such as DNA test results, which are essential for their further processes. And again, they have no access to skills training and livelihood support so they can rebuild their lives. When I was in Mali, I spoke to 3 children. They were teenage girls, but in their early teens. And their distress was that they were mocked by their school friends, and the parents of their school friends wouldn't allow them to play with them anymore. So, this is reality. I use this feedback in my interaction with the UN and member states, and to shape my work streams and inform them particularly of the work of the advocates and focal points. And it's been very satisfying, and I'll just give you one example to see what advocates do. And I'll talk about the advocate in Haiti. In Haiti, we have over 35 outstanding paternity child maintenance claims relating to personnel from a peace mission from some years ago, MINUSTA. And the advocate there, supported by me, has tried to solve these, including by mobilizing pro bono lawyers in countries of jurisdiction, because Haiti, in any event, Haiti, were it the country of jurisdiction at the moment, its judicial system isn't working and its courts are mainly occupied by armed groups. But the countries of jurisdiction who has gone home and left the children in Haiti. They're complicated transnational cases. They require individual attention, hands-on attention. And this person, the senior victims' rights officer relating to at least one today, she came with me last year when we went to 2 countries where the fathers of these, where the jurisdiction lies with regard to fathers of some of these children. In fact, I think we're looking at 9 plus 4. So of these children, a significant number of them relate to these countries. And so we're seeking to push and push and push. We haven't had results yet, but we're getting close. She also supports livelihood skills upgrading for the mothers, arranges payment of the children's school and associated fees, and nutritional basket school lunches for them. Now, these are the sorts of things that go some way to restore the dignity of victims and hold us to account. They re-establish trust in our organizations and personnel as well, but that trust is easily lost. So we have to sustain that support, and we face significant resource constraints. And it's a very complicated organization, and we can't, it's not a nimble organization. And it's very well, what I'm seeking to do is to have this notion that these are not inevitable wrongs, but they're definitely expectable. So be prepared. And also some advocacy. I'm traveling soon to South Africa, where I will discuss with them their pre-deployment approach and how they might indeed preemptively deal with the fact that there might be sexual exploitation and or abuse leading to paternity, leading to where children might be abandoned. So there's a lot of things that must be done. Now I'll just I know I've spoken for a long time. But I will just highlight challenges. I'll just go through this telegraphically, as people will say. So the first is, and I've just pre-visioned this, support and assistance sometimes does not exist often, or if it does exist, and it's usually provided through existing services. It's supposed to be provided through existing, generally gender-based violence services that are available on the ground. If it does exist, they may not, those who provide those may not understand the particular requirements of victims of our personnel. And in any event, these services are chronically underfunded. And as I said, non-existent in some cases. And in those areas where those Gabonese were, in Central African Republic, there are very, very little in the way of services. And the servicing can be of more or less variable quality. I've spoken about the paternity claims. That's an enormous, enormous challenge. Accountability of the perpetrator. Enormously difficult. The United Nations, where civilian personnel are concerned, the United Nations is an employer. It doesn't have anything more than administrative and disciplinary measures to sanction personnel. It doesn't have any civil, it doesn't have any criminal power. And in terms of something that might meet the definition of a crime, it has an obligation, the Secretary General has an obligation to refer those to the nationality concerned, to the state of jurisdiction, which will be generally the state of the nationality of the alleged perpetrator. Unfortunately, most member states do not do anything about this. And as I say, there was we had quite a high profile case that was where the former staff member was sentenced to a long jail term by a United Nations district court last year. What he engaged in was multiple drugging and sexual acts of drugging and sexually assaulting women and making false statements. So that jurisdiction was very proactive. That jurisdiction wanted to bring, sort of have a successful case, and did have a successful case, but that is very rare. So we talk about this case, the Al-Qurani case, but we need other states to do that as well. Final challenge. Well, there are many challenges, but we need to. There's so much work to get our leaders and personnel understand that what the victim's rights approach means. And it is not just feeling warm towards victims. It requires, a knowledge that respect, acknowledgement of intersectional discrimination, confidentiality, follow what the victim wants, these sorts of things. So this is an area that requires a lot more work. And as I say, they get lost in translation. People get excited about the topic, and then they start talking about. They get very excited. Law is always exciting, but law may not be the answer to everything. So law, the question may be posed, but the answer may not be law. And I'm a lawyer. I'm very fond of the law. I very much believe in legal processes, but people do get a little hung up and stuck on the excitement of the technicality, and they lose the victim. They lose the child who's born of sexual exploitation and abuse. So I'll stop at that point. We've got only 15 minutes, but that's not bad. And over to you, Alexandra, and thank you again for having me today. I think you're mute.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Jane, and thank you for making us reflect on, indeed, how much we focus on the perpetrators and we don't focus enough on victims and victim support. So obviously a very, very important role you play there. Any questions? Would you like to ask any specific questions? If you would like to, in the reactions, you can raise your hand and then you can take the floor. But until you kind of feel less shy to ask the questions, can I ask, as a UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, I'm very interested in some of the risks that I could read in the literature, especially when it comes to values and values that undermine the victims from speaking out. And I was wondering, do you have any links? I mean, I can understand that it's a very focused mandate that you have, but, you know, do you have links, and do you have the space and the time and to link your mandate with other parts of the United Nations? And have you found this helpful? So treaty bodies, different monitoring bodies, etc.
I do have, because I come out of the human rights stable, and I have to say, human rights, it's not, you know, human rights is misunderstood, and also we often have, and not necessarily very popular in all parts of the United Nations. And we have, I mean, there's a call to action for human rights that was produced by the Secretary General several years ago, which describes human rights as the highest aspiration, which irritated me intensely, because human rights it's not an aspiration by any stretch of the imagination. It is a legal framework, and it's a legal framework just the same as the law of contracts is a legal framework. So the author of that was very enthusiastic when he came to me. He said, "What did you think?" And I said, "I was very irritated because it's not an aspiration." So yes, so there's that, and now the Secretary General is speaking a little bit more of human rights than he did before, but it is a little bit of a problem because it suggests the accountability of member states, and member states are accountable, irrespective of, you know, well, most member states are accountable for the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. A high proportion of member states are accountable for the implementation of CEDAW and so on. So I do, in fact, interact as much as I possibly can early on. You can push the meeting of special rapporteurs to invite me to come to Geneva and speak to them about my mandate. I mean, I have reached out. I did, in fact, I have we do transmit to human rights treaty bodies confidential briefs, short briefs on issues. I've got to be. It's a difficult balancing act, because I can't really transmit open. I mean, I can transmit to particular rapporteurs. I have organised meetings of the rapporteurs whose mandates are similar to mine, the country rapporteurs I also engage with. So yes, indeed, I do reach out. But, you know, everybody's busy and they forget me. I don't forget them as much as they forget me, because when I travel to the countries, I am always informed by the outcome of the UPR, the outcome of the human rights treaty bodies, whether a rapporteur has visited, and so on and so forth. And I also, and I've developed a good relationship with GANRI, the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. I meet with national institutions, importantly because, and with civil society in the field of human rights, because they are there on the ground. We are elsewhere, and therefore they are needed and we hopefully we will go, and they need to sustain the work to support the rights of victims of our personnel.
And can I ask you, when you say the support for the victims, I understand you talked about how you are by their side when they go through the process. But do you find that maybe because of resources, etc., you know, at some stage you have to let them go, and then do you find that at some stage they will need more support, that the support that you can give?
I think we have to be realistic about the support that is given, and the support that is given at the moment, we don't know. I mean, we only have access to the victims we know about. Few come forward, and those who come forward, we seek to do what we can. As I said, with support and assistance, the view is it's provided through existing structures, and we need to shore those up. The financial support available for victims is very limited and usually project-based. So there isn't, and they complain, there isn't sort of a cash transfer or anything like that. They would like something that they could manage themselves. So there's not this sort of paternalistic or maternalistic approach to, well, we're dealing with people who are unable to manage their lives, so sort of thing. But most of it is project-based, so it's a bit of a struggle, and the legal support is particularly poor because they're complex cases. A transnational case, we have a lot of civil society organizations saying, yes, we can support and what have you, but we need to have those civil society organizations who deal in legal support in an informed way. So a paternity claim, for example, few people who do law do study family law. It's usually an option. Now, I did, and I taught family law, amongst other things, but it's usually an optional subject. So family law is, and it's not exactly a subject which is regarded, I mean, I suppose banking's up there, what have you, but it isn't regarded as, you know, sort of not many people do it. And then if you have a transnational case, it becomes even more complicated. So legal support is difficult. So I think we can't romanticize what is out there. And I'm not the sort of UN staff member who says everything is fabulous. So there's much more that needs to be done. And getting people to understand and getting pressure on us, I have no difficulties with these critical articles and so on. I think it's good to keep us on our toes. They should be informed, however, and not say, you know, the UN should prosecute X, Y, and Z, because that's not possible. But I have no difficulty in pressurizing, well, pressurizing the state you come from. What are you doing with regard to? We did a project actually on what was available in the way of support and assistance in 13 countries a couple of years ago. And one of the countries we looked at was Greece. And I had to go and speak. I spoke to all of the permanent representatives of the countries where we were going to look at the services. And the permanent representative of Greece was somewhat surprised that we were going to Greece. And I said, well, it's nothing about Greece. It's about the fact that there are many people in Greece who are in very difficult circumstances, having arrived seeking shelter from extremely, you know, in difficult humanitarian or conflict situations. And there are people on the ground from the United Nations and also implementing partners who might take advantage of those people. So she understood, but it's always a surprise, you know, it seems to be something that's associated with, but it was patchy. I mean, there's support available in places where people are, and it's much better than other places, still patchy.
I guess, you know, having a mirror in front of us and realizing that we're not as holy as we think we are when it comes to human rights, and it's not always this other exotic place that has human rights violations, is a very good surprise for the evolution of human rights. And this is the other thing I wanted to ask you. So, you know, the projects that you have are, you know, I did see Greece in there as well, but I did see that they are in non-European places, yet I suspect from what you were talking that the perpetrators may come from other places, including European places. Do you find that the, shall we call them the states of the North? They
get a bit of a surprise, actually, because
helpful after the surprise? Do they want to help?
Yes, it is helpful because, you know, there'll be, you know, when I'll say, you know, there are cases, paternity cases, there are many paternity cases outstanding. And these are people, these are the cases we know about. So those are people who worked in peacekeeping context. So the most information we have is about the peacekeeping context. And that there has been a longer history of keeping tabs on the data and having tools to collect and also maintain the data. So you know, I say, well, of course, your country has cases. They do look, and the surprise is helpful. the surprise is helpful. But in terms of uniformed personnel, as you know, it is not the North that deploys the uniformed personnel, although there are some. But it's predominantly the countries of the South, and that can be difficult because of the issues with regard to, there is always well, of course, they are not informed, the culture and what have you. And you're the cultural rights rapporteur, so you'll be able to think about this. They are, this to me, although relevant in terms of humans, is not that relevant in terms of the fact they are UN personnel. They have agreed to subscribe to UN values, to UN standards. So I think they need to, and we have to work on this, deal with, they don't have to go into peacekeeping. And if they go into peacekeeping, they have to abide by the standards. I see you've got 2 more questions, and we're
Yes,
coming
Joe
to the
and
end.
Mary.
Hi, I've got a question from a student in the chat box that she's direct messaged to me, so I'm afraid you won't be able to read that, so I'll just read it out for her. So, building on what Professor Xanthaki just asked, this was probably a question or so ago, I'd like to know about linkages between the OVRA and the Security Council, particularly under the Women, Peace and Security agenda, given the obligation on states to take action on SC resolutions and how this may help to close the accountability gap. I'm also wondering about cross-fertilisation, especially with the ICC victims participation and reparations section, as well as the research done on approaches to sexual violence under ICTY and ICTR to inform the OVRA's work and to feed back into larger international approaches to the justice side of these cases.
Maybe I have a meeting, unfortunately, at 10 in my time. But just quickly, I have... is that Mary's question, or Mary's got her hand up?
No, Mary's another question. Do you want us to take both questions? And
yes, please, that would be good.
Mary, you have 1 minute, sorry.
Okay, my question has to do with this. So we have talked about sexual exploitation by UN staff, and my question is there a problem that is not being addressed that needs to be looked at? What is this need that is coming up so frequently in these situations that needs to be dealt with? Can the UN look for a way of meeting the needs? For example, do these UN staff have their families with them wherever they go? Is there a way of making sure that their needs are met so that they don't necessarily sexually exploit the people where they work? Thank you.
I'll deal with the last question first, because this is a question I often do. And this, of course, is a perpetrator-centered approach rather than a victim-centered approach. They don't have their families with them in obviously the uniformed personnel do not have their families with them. And there are many duty stations which are non-family duty stations. And then there are duty stations, humanitarian development, which are family duty stations. In terms of the uniformed personnel, it is the obligation of the state which provides them to provide them with the appropriate conditions in which they should live, which they should work. Often they do not do so, and often the fact that people live in difficult conditions and don't have their families, don't have access to internet, don't have movies at night, don't have the sports that movies at night, day, or whenever they might want to watch them, don't have access to sport are put forward as reasons for the fact that they exploit and abuse. And when we're talking of abuse, we're talking of child sexual abuse often. So they're put forward as things we should pay attention to. Obviously, it doesn't help if people are in difficult situations, but at the same time, we know that people in extremely privileged situations engage in sexual abuse and sexual exploitation. And we only have to think about Jeffrey Epstein. So this is an issue I think we need to have. It is obviously a violation if the contributing state doesn't provide the support and assistance required for their personnel. It also is important that people understand the conditions that they're going to be in, but those cannot be put forward as they could be put forward as contributing, but they are certainly not issues that I think are overarching. And many people work in these difficult situations and do not engage in this behaviour. On the former question, and very quickly, I've been in touch with all of these people. I organised a very interesting meeting in 2019 prior to all of the COVID and so on, where I brought together people from the ICC, people from the various who'd been in the various tribunals, people worked in trafficking, victims commissioners. There are victims commissioners in nation states. I brought those all together, and I continue to seek to work with them. I'm very close friends to the SRSG Sexual Violence in Conflict. I don't have a reporting line to the Security Council, but I do keep the SRSG informed. So the problem with our life in the UN is it's pretty siloed. It takes a lot of energy to keep in touch with all of the mechanisms, but I do try my best. I'm afraid I have to go.
Thank you so much. We really would like to have you for another at least 2 hours, and our students to ask you questions. But thank you so much for giving us an insight, and for also making our students reflect that after the end of their master's degree, maybe there is some leeway for pro bono work there and placements, etc. in this area, in this field. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we do have internships, and you can look at our website. We do have, and they can be online, and we do have online volunteers, so who might be able to drop in and drop out with working with us. And all of you, when you're contemplating your future and where you want to work, don't forget the UN. It's a great place to work. There are challenges, but it's a great place. Thank you so much, Alexandra and Joanne. Thanks for all your help, and I'd love to speak to you again.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.